So I did my project on Monhegan Island, Maine, and Monhegan is an island that is northeast of Portland. It's one of the biggest and most famous islands off the coast of Maine. And the reason I was interested in Monhegan, my family had a house in Maine when I was younger. Actually, up until I was around 16 or 17 years old, we had a house up in Maine in a town called Bristol. And so I was looking around, and I knew that this assignment was supposed to be something about a place that we feel connected to. And so I was looking at Bristol, and it's such a tiny town still that there's not a whole lot of information on Bristol. And so I looked at the neighboring towns to Bristol, which are Round Pond and Pemaquid and Damariscotta. And so I looked at those. There really wasn't any information at all, but when I would click in anything about Maine, I found a lot of information regarding Monhegan, and so I thought I'd go from there. And then the other thing that I was thinking about doing at the beginning of the project was I've heard a lot of stories from a lot of friends of mine who live in Maine year-round about, and also newspaper articles and things like that, about lobstermen in Maine. And obviously that's one of the biggest industries in Maine. It's one of their biggest exports and everything like that. And so I wanted to look at lobstering because I've heard a lot of stories recently about how lobstermen, they do okay during the summer, and actually strangely enough on Monhegan people lobster in the winter just because it's deeper water and the lobster like the cold that way. Or sorry, not the cold, the warmth that's provided by the deep water. And so anyway, in coastal Maine though, during the summer the lobstermen are okay, but then they've got this really, really long winter to kill, and they've got, it gets really dark early, it's really dreary, and so I guess there have been lots and lots of cases of just horrible drug abuses and things along those lines that are, it's just interesting because they're these really quiet little sleepy towns with tiny populations, and to think that these towns, you drive through them in the summer and you think that it's really wholesome, but actually there's horrible drug addictions and alcoholism and things like that that sort of plague these towns because of lobstering. So I really wanted to look at Bristol and Damariscotta and Round Pond and those towns and relate that to sort of the lobstering lifestyle and the alcoholism and the drug addiction that is a problem, but I just couldn't find enough information, so I decided to go with Monhegan. And so with the Monhegan information, I chose the creative option, which was A, and so I needed to come up with a cast of characters who would take me from the early and late 1800s right through the 1900s. And so there's actually 3 generations that I discussed. The narrator is, let's see, he would be around 20 or 22 years old at the time of World War II, but he's writing probably 10 years after World War II. And his father and grandfather, that's who he's writing about basically, and he's writing about their lifestyles growing up and living on Monhegan and stuff. And so that was how I weaved around. But I found some pretty interesting factual data about Monhegan and used that sort of as a backbone for my paper, along with just common knowledge that I have from being exposed to Monhegan and the area that Monhegan is in Maine for a long time now. And so what I relied on mostly were articles from New York Times Historical and the other one, the periodicals from 1740 through 1900. And what I found were just these really, I don't know, they were funny articles about a famous sea captain going to slay the sea serpent and the various pirate attacks and stuff like that. And so I tried to have my characters encounter all of these different things, and it actually ended up working really well. So I started off with the grandfather in the story was born, let's see, in around 1854. I think he was 20 years old, so he was born around 1834, and in 1854, I found an article in the New York Times Historical, I think, about a pretty famous archaeologist coming down from either Bangor or Bar Harbor. I think it was Bar Harbor, Maine, but I think that this archaeologist was actually based out of Boston. Anyway, out on Monhegan, Monhegan has a little sister island that's called Manana, and Manana is really just across the harbor from Monhegan. It's really part of the same island, but they're considered two separate islands. And so this archaeologist came out in search of these inscriptions that are on the rocks on Manana still, and you can go by boat to see them if you go out to Monhegan still. But there's these carvings in the rocks right across the way, and they're thought to be from like ancient Scandinavians or something like that. And so anyway, there's an article dating back to 1854, I think, or maybe 1856, about this archaeologist coming. And so I have my grandfather in the story has just bought his first boat, and so he's delighted to be able to take this archaeologist across the way to Manana and show him the inscriptions and stuff. And even though he's a big tough guy, he's really delighted to, even though he doesn't understand why anyone would want to waste their time doing something as silly as archaeology, where you're just going around reading inscriptions and stuff. He's pretty delighted to have been part of what seems like a pretty big deal to him, to the archaeologist. So anyway, that's where that's sort of the first example. That's where you enter the story, and then the next thing that happens is probably 10 years later. I found an article dating from the 1860s about a pirate from Nova Scotia coming down in a vessel called the Tallahassee, and the article was just hysterical. It really wasn't. I guess it was factual because it was in the New York Times, or at least it was supposed to be factual. But it was really, really funny. They talked about how this guy came down from Nova Scotia and he was just terrorizing boats, and it would say things like Pirate Tallahassee, is said to disguise himself as a Portlander in search of stealing some Portland vessels, and it was just all said very matter-of-factly, but it was really, really funny. So anyway, I have the grandfather in the story is the only guy on Monhegan, and this part is fictional, but he's the only guy on Monhegan who's brave enough to fish through that summer, even though the pirate Tallahassee is going around terrorizing all these boats. And so my grandfather, who obviously knows Monhegan and its waters better than anyone else does, is out there fishing, and none of his friends are fishing because they're all scared of Tallahassee. And